Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new interview web show called Mark Who 77. This show is to promote the 77 publications and British comic books as well. I'm your host, Mark Baumgarten. You may know me from the show Mark Who 42's Universe. Along for the ride are Vicky Jakubowski, also of Mark Who 42, and rounding out our number is Ben Cullis, editor-in-chief at the 77 publications. Hey, guys.
Hey.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing good. So I think this is our first show. We're doing Mark Who 77.
I've got it down number one here on my sheet.
Show number one. That's always good.
A collector's item, no doubt.
Yeah. So basically what this is going to be is, well, you're watching it now. We're on the 77 Comics YouTube page. It's 77 Comics or 77 Publications, Ben?
It's 77 publications.
77 publications. Well, you're watching it, so you already know that. We are going to be interviewing comic book writers and artists, and maybe even some editors that have something to do, contribute to the 77, and also British comic books in general. So how are you guys doing? How's the weather out? I always talk about the weather. Ben, what's the weather like in England?
Slightly oppressive now. We've got a bit of grey sky. I think it's going to rain. You know, good weather for cricket, basically.
There you go. Vicky, what's been going on with you?
It's not snowing. We
Okay.
completely skipped spring. It'll be 91 degrees today, and then we're going to have thunderstorms and torrential rains tonight.
Well, we're having similar, and you're in Reno and I'm in Florida. Yeah, you can hear my voice is a little hoarse because I was writing into this show.
Oh.
All right, I'm sorry. That's a dad joke. Sorry.
Woo!
So I'll do the joke next time, okay?
You can do the joke next time, Ben.
And I will groan appropriately then for that.
Yeah. So we've got a great show for you today with a very special guest. Ben, why don't you introduce him?
Certainly. We're going to have Steve Parkhouse on, who is an incredibly versatile writer. He started off in the business some 50 years ago, working out of Birmingham and London, went to London to seek his fortune, was working in stalwart comics such as Victor and Valiant, and anything with a V in front of it, I think, to be honest with you. Vicky, you know. And
He's always good.
Came to my attention as a young reader when he was working with Alan Moore
Yes.
on the Bo Jeffries saga, which he did some wonderful illustrations for, and I sure we'll find some, and is known to a wider audience through his work with Doctor Who and a whole plethora of different titles. I'm sure he'll be prepared to tell us a whole list of them. And he's I consider him to be a personal friend of mine. I've had the pleasure of his company on a few occasions, going up to Cumbria, beautiful part of the northwest of England, in the Lake District. It's a beautiful place to live. And yeah, we've had some great conversations about all sorts of things. And yeah, it's a pleasure to have him on as our first guest.
All right, so let's take it away. Welcome, Steve, to our show. How you doing today?
Moderately okay, thanks. Yeah.
Moderately?
That's about all I can manage. Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. Well, my first question, the first thing I want to talk about is your background, a little about your life. Who and what is Steve Parkhouse? What have you done? What are you doing? I know that's the hardest question. I'm getting the hard question out of the way. Everything else will be simpler.
No, you should have asked about the weather in Cumbria today. That's the inn.
Oh, yeah. How is the weather?
Hot. It's hot. It's kind of stuffy and humid, and it will probably freeze tonight. That's the usual pattern.
Okay.
Who and what am I? Well, I'm a writer, stroke illustrator, stroke letterer. Whenever I'm asked, I work for people who ask me to do work for them. It's as simple as that.
Okay.
And I've been doing that for just over 50 years in the comics business.
Do you consider yourself a writer, or more an artist?
I consider myself a storyteller, which covers all the ground. And I think that storytelling is probably at the heart of what people do when they're in comics, if they've been paying attention. A lot of people haven't been, but that's their problem.
Well, have you always wanted to be a storyteller? I mean, at what point did you go, oh, I want to make this my career?
That was decided for me by circumstance. I never intended to get into comics. I was trained as a graphic designer. And that's where my visual interest began. The art school environment is, it leaves you very open to any kind of visual input. And it also gives you methods and techniques by which to express them. But I just love drawing anyway, so I would always turn up at the life drawing classes, and I was a model student.
Cool, very cool. Ben?
When did you study, Steve?
Where?
Yeah,
it was a polytechnic in East London, East Ham, actually, which is right next to West Ham, which you've probably heard of. And I was there with Barry Windsor Smith, who you may have heard of.
Yes.
And John Bolton was there. And we had a teacher called Ralph Steadman, who's quite well known as well.
Wow.
Wow.
We know some of the big, heavy hitting names that you've worked on, like the Hulk and Doctor Who, Time Bandits, and the House of Hammer. I'm a huge Hammer film fan. So
well, you've done your homework, haven't you?
I also liked school very much, but my school was very different. My first degree was in English literature and theater, so God help the world. But it just, I mean, you clearly worked on some things that would fit into my favorite categories. But was it difficult jumping into established characters and established stories and making your own? How do you do that? That sounds like a heavy lift.
It's a long apprenticeship. You know, I say I've been in the comics business for 50 years. The first 25 years was learning how to do it. So it's a very long apprenticeship, and you go down a lot of blind alleys and you get a lot of criticism. And I wanted to give up about every other week, but something persuaded me to carry on because it was the only thing I knew by then. And it was either that or looking in newspapers to see what jobs were open on a local level. And I didn't want to drive a van. I didn't want to drive a bus. You know.
Well, I'm glad you didn't change careers.
So it was, to be honest, it was meeting Barry Windsor Smith or being a fellow student with him that got me into comics, American comics in the first place. I was a big fan of European and British comics. I read them all through my childhood and really loved them. But he introduced me to Marvel Comics, which I thought were, how can I put it, a little unsophisticated at that point compared to European comics. But the storytelling was very interesting. All the artists were really good storytellers, like all the big names like Kirby and Steranko and all the people that we know about.
All right. Now, I have to ask this question because of the Who part and the logo of Mark Who 77. Now, you had done written for Doctor Who magazine, the comic strip. You started with the Tom Bakers, you went to Peter Davison, and then you went to Colin. That's where you stopped. Now, the character Frobisher, the Penguin, did you create him?
Oh, absolutely.
The Whippoorwill, my question is, were you upset when Alan McKenzie, after you left, when Alan McKenzie gave back his transmutation powers?
No.
No? Because
No.
I liked the problem that he had, this virus or disease that he couldn't change anymore. And then it was like it didn't get discussed anymore. And then eventually it went back to it. But I don't know.
Well, to be honest, Mark, I never get upset at decisions that editors make.
Right.
I think it's part of the job. If you get upset, it's kind of unprofessional.
True.
You just take it on board and move on, which basically is what I did. And also, you don't own those characters; they're not yours to own.
That is true.
Like in the same way that ideas are not property, well, characters are not property either. If you've signed the contract, you have to suffer the consequences.
Okay.
Is that a fair answer?
Yeah, I guess that's my answer. And since you wrote for the 4th, 5th, and 6th, who is your favorite Doctor?
My favorite Doctor was always Tom Baker.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I think he was a very much a larger than life character in himself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he put a spin on the Doctor, which I found quite refreshing from the older Doctors. Patrick Troughton and who was the first one?
William Hartnell.
William Hartnell.
Yeah.
I found the William Hartnell. I know it was the beginning of everything, but I found it quite dull. I found Patrick Troughton a lot more interesting as a character. It's a little more fantasy, a little more impish, and I think it just developed from there. But I think latterly, I think the whole TV series improved a lot. When was it Christopher Eccleston took over?
Yeah, when they restarted it in 2005.
Yeah,
and then it became even more of a massive hit when David Tennant took over.
Yeah, I think it improved tremendously from that point on. It was much more like the kind of material I wanted to introduce into the comic strip, which was no holds barred, anything goes.
Mm-hmm.
You ignore the purists and you just tell a story. And if it fitted the genre, then so much the better.
All right. Vicky, let's get out of Doctor Who. What do you want to ask?
Well, actually, Steve made an interesting point because it makes me think about fans.
Mm-hmm.
Being a fan myself of many of these genres and comic books, loved comic books as a kid, have just started to forgive my mother for throwing them away back in the 70s. But some fans get very possessive about these characters.
Yeah.
And, how do you, as a creator, as a storyteller, deal with some of the fans who, frankly, some of us are a little unreasonable, just a little bit. We get a little kind of, you were saying like the purist, and some people are like, well, this has to be this and this has to be that. And how do you deal with that? Because I know you've gone to like conventions and other events, so you've had to meet some of us crazies.
Not as far as Doctor Who is concerned, no. When I was writing Doctor Who, I didn't even have a TV set.
Wow.
That's how detached I was from the whole thing. And I think in order to get an overview that if you want to tell the stories you want to tell, you need to be somewhat detached. And if fans don't like it, you ignore them because
I find that refreshing.
Well, at the height of my writing career on Doctor Who, I was writing a story thread called Tides of Time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And Alan Mackenzie said that the mail on that was piling up in the hallway. So I think that was a fair response.
Yeah.
And it was all pretty positive.
If I remember correctly, Tides of Time was the first one with the Fifth Doctor that you did.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, having personally enjoyed lots of different time periods and genres of the various comics, Star Wars, Star Trek, you name it. I love it all. And the different versions and the different stories. And I do find it very refreshing that you don't feel like you have to be tied down to an often arbitrary set of, thou shalt not pass this and that, and tell a really good story.
Well, I think I made it clear from the outset that I was not a fan of the show. I was interested as a professional, and I was interested in what the writers were doing, and particularly what the actors were doing, how they were building a character.
Mhm.
I'm interested in those technical aspects. I'm not interested in those people that will follow every little pathway, every little route to their idea of perfection. It doesn't always work if you're trying to be creative.
Oh, well, that's
So
great. Yay.
I think in order to be true to yourself and be as creative as you can be, you just have to work outside that particular box. I hope that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense to me. And I've had those arguments with other people. They're like, well, I didn't like the new Star Wars, or I didn't like the new Star Trek. And I'm like, well, okay, yes, it diverges, but was it a good story? Did it keep you involved? Did you like it? If you just didn't like the way a character arced, well, but was the character still the character? Was the story still good? And I'm a firm believer in good storytelling. And there's so often we've talked about shows, and I'm always like, the story was fabulous. And that's what I look for. And I wish more creators would be less afraid of being disliked by fans.
Yes. I mean, I didn't want to offend anybody.
Right.
It's not in my nature to be offensive. I wanted to give people a more expansive view of the potential in the character and the scenario that he operated in. So he was going beyond time and space. Why shouldn't I?
Very good point.
It's interesting, Steve, when you said when you were in the midst of it all, you weren't consuming it, didn't have a television. I'm in the midst of publishing comics, and I only really read my publications at the moment, and that's only proofreading.
Well, that's a bit of a confession there.
I can't afford to buy many other comics, to be honest with you.
I don't know how you feel. Yeah, well, I can't even remember why I didn't have a TV. I think I just got fed up with television as a medium in itself. I only ever watch sport on TV anyway. I know that might sound like, I can't even think of the word, but I was not a great TV fan. I have been in the past when I thought TV programs were vastly superior. And they were in British, I'm talking about British television.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
British television in the 60s and perhaps early 70s were graced with a fantastic sort of stable of writers.
Yeah.
And they were who I followed the writers. I didn't follow a particular character or the programs themselves. I was interested to see how these writers were pushing the boundaries of the medium. And that's always interested me.
Which writers did you follow? Which shows did you follow?
Oh, no, you've got me there.
Oh, because everyone you mentioned, if you would mention some, I was going to automatically say, yeah, I've heard of it because I probably have. I am such an Anglophile, it's pathetic.
Are you thinking of sort of Ian LaFrenne and, the writers of the sort of Likely Lads and that lot, or are you talking more the science fiction stuff?
No, I was thinking of do you remember the Wednesday plays?
Right.
And the crime series like Softly Softly and Z-Cars.
Z-Cars, yeah.
One particular writer stands out. It's a guy called Alan Pryor, who I think he did some of the very early Z-Cars and then moved on into Softly Softly. But he was writing crime fiction, if that's possible on TV. He was writing crime stories revolving around the personal lives of the policemen, rather than the machinations of the criminals. which made it that much more interesting. And it just wasn't really that well known an approach back in the day. You know, you had to have a modicum of violence and hostile characters in order to maintain a crime series. Whereas the series that were being written in the late 60s were character driven, and most of the characters were policemen with all their frailties and all their problems, which gave you an insight into someone who knew how the police worked. As a writer, I think he had very close contacts with off-duty policemen, maybe even went to the same pubs, I don't know. But that's how writers worked then. They mingled with people. They came out of their caves and got involved in the general population. And that's where they got their stories from.
My sister's father, so my mother's first husband, was Dave Martin, one of the Bristol boys who worked on series Doctor Who 3, 4, and was well known for many other series as well in British TV in the 70s. And he did that thing as well of basically going to the right pubs, talking to the right people when he was writing crime work or such like. In fact, all he had to do was talk to my dad, because my dad was actually a bit of one of those people.
Another confession there.
Good. I'm going to use this confessional. But what's interesting is that he said all you have to do, he just said one of the things you need to do as a writer is just listen really hard and pick up people's conversations, pick up how people talk about things, how they relate things, and you know, there will come a time when you can use it.
I guess it's a continuation possibly of their background in journalism. They do what journalists do. They look for the stories that are actually on the street, and then they start researching, maybe like a private eye would, to find out who the characters were, where they lived, what their background was, and try and stay out of trouble at the same time. It's kind of edgy. That's what I liked about TV back in the day. It was very edgy because it was all kind of new.
Yeah. Now, I like the idea of the character driven, and I find that I like, whether it's a story, a movie, or a TV show, when it's got that character that grabs me and interests me and makes me want to know more.
I think in the States, maybe one of the American crime series I really liked was called The Naked City.
I actually just got the DVD set of season 1. I'm in the middle of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going back a bit there, but I would always follow that. It was a really good cast of characters. Very believable.
Yes.
8 million stories in The Naked City.
Yeah.
This has been one of them. Yeah. Can I ask you about working with an individual, Steve? You said that you've been a storyteller, and one of my favorite strips, you were the artist, and I didn't know whether you would admit to maybe editing any of the work that you were dealt with when you were working on the Bo Jeffries saga.
It depends what you mean by editing.
Well, interpret it in your own special way, not necessarily as prescripted on the page.
Well, I don't know. Have you seen an Alan Moore script?
Yes, it's quite lengthy, isn't it?
Well, he's a novelist. Alan is essentially a novelist, and that's how he writes everything. So I was getting descriptive passages this long. I don't know if you can see that on the screen. This, I can't even, it's about the length of an average bath towel.
Wow.
And I had to interpret every little nuance. So essentially, I learned a technique which might sound a little bit harsh and a little bit arrogant, but I still apply it today. When a script lands on my desk, I read it through once, set it aside, and then just do what I want to do. Basically keeping the story in mind. And I have been an editor in my career. I was an editor for 3 years. So I haven't quite lost touch with some of those methods of adhering to a storyline through thick and thin, regardless of what the writer would like. And I might even occasionally change some of the words in the balloons. If it stands better, you know. But I'm given, I mean, in my defense, I'm given carte blanche to do that. So why not take advantage? You know, if a writer's written something a bit clumsy, I'll just nudge it into shape.
Yeah.
And then it runs a little more smoothly. And in my current incarnation as the artist on Resident Alien, people have no idea what goes on in the background. They just see a fusion, which is an accomplishment in itself of words and pictures, and everything is as smooth as anything. It takes an awful lot of concentration and focus to achieve that. And that's what I mean by storytelling. It's the absolute heart of what we do.
You were very prolific for 2000 AD comic. I was wondering about your experience there, and most importantly, Big Dave.
Yeah, Big Dave was an absolute joy. It really was. It was just so aggressive. It was so anti-English. And I loved it. I mean, I live about 4 miles from the Scottish border, so I'm quite fond of the Scots as a nation. And having 2 Scottish writers work with me was just wonderful. I mean, it was really acerbic and anti-English, and I just love that. So I tried to sort of maintain that feeling, become detached from my Englishness, because I'm quite English by nature, sort of throw that out the window and become an honorary Scot. And I think it helped me to keep the momentum going, because those guys were writing to an extreme, and I had to mirror that in the artwork. And I think more often than not, we sort of hit the target because we got so many complaints.
Well, it was the summer offensive. It was offensive, yeah.
I mean, they couldn't argue with that, could they? They were
you didn't false advertise. That's what was on the wrapper.
Yeah. Some people were, I suppose, naturally offended by some things that got a little bit close to real life events, like child murder and stuff like that, which nobody wants to make fun of.
Right.
But what people didn't understand, really, the people that complained didn't really understand what the premise of Big Dave was. The premise of Big Dave was to parody the British gutter press.
Yeah.
And the way in which they announced their news items. And I think they did that very successfully in the language they used and the sort of mock journalese that they used a lot of the time. And people took the content to be the satire, but the satire was overlaying everything. It overlaid the content. It was a satire on British or English journalism.
Well, you know, talking about satire, I found it very interesting when I kind of looked over your CV, and, you know, you do these great fictitious characters like Nick Fury and Judge Dredd, and then you do satire in 2000 AD on these real life people like the British royal family, and it feels like, you know, very different genres, different thought processes.
Yeah, I'm a total schizophrenic.
No wonder I like you.
There you go.
No, I mean, I'll explain. It's a good question. It's a good point. I was classically taught to draw from Greek and Roman sculptures, but I'm a cartoonist at heart and a satirist. If I can make people laugh or even just smile, that makes me happy. There are times when you're not always called upon to do that. People want you to draw something that's nice. and recognizable. So I put my other hat on and I go back to my classic training and I draw everything sort of anatomically almost correct. And I just get by. So it all depends on who's commissioning and on what they're after. But unfortunately, I've lost an awful lot of my drawing skill set through working on computers.
Oh.
And if I'm asked to do a commission, which means a piece of original art, it takes me months and months and months just to summon the courage to even try it. That's a side issue. Sorry?
I said, is it in the muscle memory, and your body loses that, the kind of
Absolutely.
ability to.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, you don't have an undo button.
Yeah.
If you mess up a piece of original art, it just goes in the bin. You can't undo it.
Yeah. So do you find it enjoyable doing the artistic endeavor via computer as much as you did via hand?
It's a different experience. It allows you to be a little more technically flexible, because you can reduce the size of what you're doing by pressing a button. You can bring it up close. It helps in terms of your posture when you're working. I mean, I spent so many years hunched over a drawing board with my nose about this far away from a piece of paper. But on a computer, you can just pull everything back and you can sit back quite comfortably and draw from a distance. And I think that actually helps because, as Ben alluded to, you start to use a different set of muscles. You start working from the shoulder, which is a lot freer than working from your wrist and your fingers. It's all kind of technical, but I'm sure you understand.
I don't know. I find it fascinating, but I can't even draw good stick figures. So, but I have several artists in my family, and I am in awe of them and every artist I meet, because somehow you're able to do something these fingers can't do and make these images flow. And so it blows my mind.
Well, it blows mine too when I see what some people do. But I mean, as I said before, it's taken 25 years to get to this point where your hand-eye coordination is such that you can draw something and repeat it and make it recognizable and commercial, which is a big consideration.
Yeah.
The artwork has to be acceptable to a whole raft of people who are going to tear it apart if it doesn't work for them. And I'm not talking about fans. I'm talking about editors, managing editors, publishers, distributors. They all want a commercial product. So it takes 25 years to shoulder that burden and to produce something that people want. It's not always about pretty pictures. It's about doing what's right. What's right for the business of producing comics, rather than the medium. I'd love to just work for the medium all the time. It's a very challenging medium, but it's also a fantastic training medium if you want to draw realistically or in any other way. But the business demands a lot of other things as well. The industry demands a lot of other things.
Cool. I heard from the grapevine, from the guy that's down here below me, that you are doing something for the 77, an essay or something like that?
It's been discussed.
Mm-hmm.
Oh no, I'm talking about your reminiscences.
Yeah.
Steve, that you've written as part of the.
There's something else?
Which is a 77 publication.
Well, Ben and I are going to talk about things when we meet up face to face in September. I'm going to try and persuade him to do things that he might not normally do, but that's probably par for the course. But yes, I wrote something.
Is the piece that you wrote on behalf of your old friend Ian Gibson.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that was an interesting thing to do, because I don't normally write a lot of text.
Mm-hmm.
And I was reminiscing about a person I knew quite well. And I was able to give a certain kind of spin on it, because we spent 2 or 3 years living in the same house, both drawing comics, making a living doing the same thing, which is kind of a rarity. Finding somebody else who does the same job is really quite rare. But living in the same house, it's almost unheard of.
Who was the better cook?
That's a good question. I should have asked that one, Ben. Sorry. Who's a better cook?
We were both pretty lousy.
Let's not get into the washing up then.
Oh, no.
So it sounds like there might have been a lot of takeaways.
No, there were other people living in the house who were better cooks than us, you know. Well, I mean, you know, we were regarded as kind of weirdos and sort of minor celebrities, so people did us a lot of favors.
Sweet.
Yeah, it was what we in Britain call a fairly cushy number.
Was that the time that Ian was doing his commercial work, or was he already started doing comics at that point?
He was just getting off the ground. Yeah, he found an agent and was getting up to concert pitch, you know, to start selling stuff, which meant working 12, 14 hours a day. And he was, I think I mentioned in the text piece, he was always sleeping. He was either working or sleeping, one of those two, very little else, for the 2 or 3 years that I knew him. Until, as I mentioned in the text, that we dragged him out for odd forays into the outside world. Like maybe to the cinema or a gig or something, you know. Because that had been his life before he got into comics. He was into various bands. He was in and out of bands. I think he tried gigging around Birmingham, which is where he came from. And he knew quite a lot of musicians who often dropped by the house. But other than that, he was sleeping or working and eating terrible food most of the time.
And you met up again in London when you were there, Steve?
Yeah, I hadn't moved away at that point, and he was interested to know what I was doing, because he didn't know anybody in Birmingham who was working in comics. I was editing at the time for IPC, so he wanted a kind of an inside track. But there was nothing at IPC that would have interested him, really, apart from maybe some girls' comics like romance stories, which he subsequently started to make a living at, not for IPC, but for European companies, which was his agent's speciality, really. So he was honing his idiosyncratic artwork to suit the industry. So yes, he stayed for a couple of days in London and then went back home. And then met up again in Walthamstow in London years later.
Would have that been around the time of 2000 AD?
No, this was before 2000 AD. I don't know what contacts he made to get into 2000 AD. It was probably through his agent again, because, you know, that those kind of things circulate amongst agencies all the time. So he may have had maybe he had a treatment that his agent showed him, asked him if he was interested. And no artist ever says no. You know, if you're self-employed, you very rarely say no, unless it's really outside your comfort zone. So that's possibly how he got into 2000 AD. It was a chance submission. That's a guess, because that's how most people
If
get
I'm
started.
right, his first work, if I remember, just reading as a someone's buying the comic was with Judge Dredd. But within about 6 or 7 years, of course, Halo Jones came along, and you know, a lot of things changed for everybody at that point, I guess.
Yeah. Wasn't he also doing a newspaper strip?
Oh, the Daily Dread. In the
Yeah.
Star. That's right. Yes.
Yeah, I think he was quite happy about that because the page rate, the pay rates were considerably higher for newspapers.
Oh wow.
But yeah, that was when I lost touch with him. I think his 2000 AD phase was when I lost touch with him. And I was working at Marvel UK at that time, and he was being fairly uncomplimentary about what Marvel UK were doing, because Ian could be very forthright, and he whatever was coming out of Marvel UK at that time, he deemed it to be atrocious, which is a really good word. Even knowing that I'd written most of it, he still thought it was garbage. So we kind of fell out at that point, because I don't think professionals should slag each other off. I think it's just not done, you know, because nobody knows the pressure that you're facing. And it was a weekly schedule at Marvel UK. And at one time I was producing 3 or 4, maybe more scripts a week.
Oh my gosh.
And with across the board, 3 or 4 different characters. And I had to keep up with that for 2 or 3 years.
Wow.
But that was nothing compared to what I was doing at IPC. I was writing about 3 scripts a day at IPC.
Oh my gosh. How in the world did you keep all that straight and not go off the edge?
What makes you think I didn't go off the edge?
Well, that's it. Okay.
Well, hence the quiet life in Cumbria.
Starting to make sense here. Well, in talking about your vast projects, do you by chance have a favorite? Was there anything that you've done, a character or a series or something that just you really, if on your headstone, I did this?
Oh, geez. That's
It's
like
one thing.
it's been like asking a parent who's their favorite child.
I know it's an evil thing to do.
I've liked everything I've worked on because, as I mentioned before, you learn so much from every job you do. And if you're interested in let's say giving value for money, which is a big requirement in the industry. If you don't give value for money, you find yourself unemployed quite quickly. Ooh. So giving people value for money means there's a hell of a lot of things you have to learn. And you learn them very quickly, and you learn them in the face of what you already know or think you know. So every character I worked on, or every scenario I worked on, was a learning curve. And the most I learned on any one strip was something called Luke Kirby, written by Alan Mackenzie. It was a sort of the forerunner of Harry Potter. So like a boy magician.
I think I read, I think I read some of that, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was quite a long running strip.
Mm-hmm.
And I came into it about halfway through. And it gave me the opportunity to work with watercolors, which is not a medium. It's not a medium that you associate with comic books or comic strips. And I really got my teeth into that, and I just loved it. So I was able to sort of splash around, make a mess, and fulfill the requirements of the job.
Wow.
Whereas every other strip I've done has been really tight. And not so much polished, that's the wrong word. I think it's very hard, slick, I think is the word. Slick and tight. Whereas if you're working with just pens and watercolors, you can be a lot more free. And it taught me a lot about color. It taught me a lot about application. It taught me a lot about how to tell a different kind of story. and it was reasonably successful. I think people quite liked it.
Nice. What's next for you?
Yeah.
What's next on the horizon for you?
Honestly, retirement.
What?
Yeah.
You're too young to retire. Stop it.
I'm 10 years past my retirement age. I've been putting it off in order to do stuff for Dark Horse.
Mm.
I desperately need a rest. You know, I need to be turned out to pasture like an old horse or something.
Oh.
I need to graze quietly, you know, in sort of bluebell woods and all that kind of stuff. I also need to do a bit more landscape work. Another reason why I liked Luke Kirby is because I was able to do real landscapes. I was able to look at the countryside around me in the Lake District and other places, and I'm able to capture the sort of atmosphere in that landscape. So what I'm hoping for is that I might actually make the grade as a real artist, rather than someone who sold their soul to, you know, the needs of my bank balance.
I don't know. Will your wife be happy with you around the house more?
I work from home anyway.
Oh, okay.
Well, we both do. We don't work in the same parts of the house, but we work from home.
Yeah.
So we meet up at meal times and shopping.
Oh, see, now that's a very smart move. I've been married for a very long time. I would highly recommend that.
Has Annie ever lettered your work?
Oh yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, she lettered quite a bit of Luke Kirby. She lettered quite a lot of Big Dave. She lettered some of my early work at Dark Horse. Yeah, she's lettered quite a lot of it. In fact, I helped her to create her computer font. I converted her handwritten font into a digital font.
Nice.
Very cool.
Is she ready to retire?
Well, she's past her retirement.
She might want to keep working.
Yeah, I suppose we are workaholics in a way. She's waiting for me to retire, and then she will retire. What she doesn't know is that I'm waiting for her to retire.
I think I had this conversation with my own husband just last week.
I think without doubt, she's possibly the most in-demand letterer in the country. I mean, her work is award-winning and in demand. So
yes,
it'll be a sad day. It'll be a sad day when yourself and Annie start watercoloring.
I don't think Annie would like to go in that direction. I mean, she's got a lot of plans of her own, but I agree. She's one of the best letterers. That's because she has a feel for how the story should be told herself. And she's sensitive to those artists who never leave enough space for lettering.
Can I say at this point, Steve, as well, of course, because we have broached the subject about Ian Gibson's Lifeboat, that Annie was sought out by Ian and we had to supply her in that. That was the only letterer that he wanted to use. So it's something that I think she's she'll be getting the work soon as well. You can tell. The artwork has been scanned and returned to me today, and it's going to be fascinating to see what she does. And
shall I warn her in advance? Or?
Now let
give her the weekend off. Give her the weekend off. Yeah.
Okay. Well, she's kind of busy. She's always busy, but she's particularly busy right now. Yeah, 2000 AD keep her fairly busy.
Wow.
Okay. Well, we've just about run out of time here for Mark Who's 77. Any final questions? Vicky's thinking.
I'm thinking
go
of
ahead.
another.
No, you have to name a restaurant that we're going to be taking out for a meal when I catch you at Lycath, Steve, when we go to Windermere and Bowness. So I don't know whether you like Thai food. I know a very good Thai restaurant in Bowness.
I'm not that fussy. If you know a good place, I'll just kind
Yeah.
of go along with that. Yeah. If I find any alternatives, I'll let you know. But I
Great.
don't know
Look
if
forward
I'll
to seeing you
necessarily
in September. Yeah.
in September. Yeah. And I dare say we'll be talking sporadically until then, communicating somehow until then.
Indeed.
Smoke signals.
Semaphore. No.
There we go.
Vicky, have you come up with your final question?
Yeah, I think I have picked this poor man's brain quite rigorously.
All right. Steve, is there anything you want to say to your, and I know we don't want to say this word, fans out there?
I would say thank you for your support and keep on buying.
That's good enough for me. Ben, can you give a little ad for the Kickstarter campaign?
Yeah, Lifeboat, just on Kickstarter. Ian Gibson's Lifeboat. It runs until the 18th of June and is doing very well. There are some pages of artwork still left. And the book will be a wonderful thing. So Steve Bull and Brendan Wright are working on that. And yeah, I want to thank all the 350 backers so far who have, in the first week and a half, have made it a reality. And Ian has been in touch. He's not been very well, but he has been in touch, and he is absolutely thrilled to know that this is actually going to happen at last. It's been a book that has been long in the making, and we're just so thrilled to be able to help him realize that ambition.
All right. Let me do some advertising. To read all these great comics, go to the 77 Publications. You can go to their Facebook page. What is the URL for the store?
You don't need a HTTP. Just go the 77comic.net. That'll take you there.
And to hear more from Vicky and myself, you can go to Subspace Radio Network at subspace.radio and listen to us. Right now, we're on like 7 days a week. And you can listen to our extended podcast at the Marku 42's Universe, which is all over the interweb thingy. Thank you once again, Steve.
Well, thank you, Mark, for having me.
All right.
And thank you, Vicky, for some really good questions.
She's got great questions, doesn't she?
Great talking to you. I really enjoy talking to you. Thank you so much for all the art you've clearly given us over the decades. Beautiful work.
Thank you very much.
Before we go, I'd like to thank Lestat for creating the title sequence. I love the title sequence we have. We hope you love it too. Thanks, Lestat. On behalf of all of us here at Marku 77, as Banksy would say, until next time, stay lucky. Bye.
Bye.